The time between the 1800s and the 1900s was pretty crazy, to say the least. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and things were changing. From new inventions that made life easier and more dangerous to new social hierarchies, Victorian life was full of it. But at the height of its remembrance, most people remember the fashion, from long skirts and cinched waists to top hats and long coats. And even though the Victorian era ended in 1901 with the death of Queen Victoria, it didn't technically end until 1914. And what was a result of this change? Fashion. So, what was Victorian fashion, and why did it die? Because of the Industrial Revolution, clothing became cheaper to make and produce and ship in mass amounts. Now marked a time where the middle class could now wear the fancy clothing that they saw the upper class wear. This was due to the fact that cheaper materials were being used. Middle class folks were also able to keep up with the latest fashion through magazines and catalogs, and as a result, fashion changed drastically. Ladies wanted to appear to have a slimmer waist, so they would use corsets to squeeze together their waist and appear slimmer. They would also use other undergarments to adjust the way that their body looked. At this time as well, hats became very popular, especially within married women, and jewelry became very popular as well. Men also desired to have slim waists. Their coats were often nipped around the waist and often were in darker colors, which gave the illusion that they were slimmer than they actually probably were. Paired with these coats were high-waisted, usually light-colored trousers, and this high-waisted trouser also gave off the appearance of a slim-looking waist. Children, on the other hand, were also dressed like their parents in fancy clothing, and were dressed to a T in most cases. Near the end of Queen Victoria's reign in 1901, fashion had pretty much remained the same for all women, men, and children. Women's waists were still sought after to be slim and have the perfect silhouette. The only major changes that had been made at this time were changes in the way the corsets were shaped and where they squeezed. So for example, by 1901, a new corset had been made that was created to put less pressure on the abdomen. Hats and jewelry were still very popular between women fashion, and it even started to take foot in men's fashion as well. By the 1910s, women's style of clothing started to shift a little bit. The dresses became slimmer. Instead of having huge skirts with petticoats that would flow out, it would just typically be one or two skirts that just hung around the ankles. The sleeves of these dresses were less puffy. It's believed that this is because of the fact that women who became more popular or more public figures began to encourage women to wear what they wanted to wear and not focus so much on looking perfect all the time. Men's wear during the early 1900s pretty much stayed the same, like I said, but around this time, especially later into near the 1910s, three-piece suits became very popular, and these were often paired with a brimmed hat. Children in the early 1900s still dressed exactly the way they used to. They were mini adults. In the time of the 1910s to the 1920s, fashion can be divided into two periods: before the World War and after the World War. In the beginning of the 1910s, clothing had a softer feel to it for women. The lines of the silhouette were less harsh. And the waistline was less slim. Lots of fashion in the early 1910s for women was based off of popular shows like ballet productions. And during this time as well, dresses began to have more color and patterns intermixed together. For men, three-piece suits remained very popular and became considered more casual compared to the suits that were worn in Victorian times. These three-piece suits were still paired with brim hats. When the war began, clothing became more simple. Tunics were worn over skirts for women and tucked into the skirt instead of dresses being worn. Production and distribution of fashion slowed during the war due to those materials being put towards military efforts, and looks as a result became more simple. And after the war, the skirts of women became more barrel-like, which would eventually lead way to the flapper dress in the Americas. During the war, for men, three-piece suits were no longer worn, and instead men wore military uniforms as they served their countries. Although the three-piece suit was brought back to popularity after the war and into the 1920s. Modern wear became more simple. During this time, dresses were still worn by girls, but by the time the war hit, they were significantly shorter and less embellished. For boys, sailor suits became very popular to wear, as well as blazers and shorts. There you have it. The Victorian fashion slowly began to decline into the 1910s after the death of Queen Victoria, and public figures began to wear more softer type clothing. The dramatic shift between Victorian style of clothing, though, happened during the First World War when supplies were limited and people found that they needed to dress more simply. And after the war, no one really wanted to go back to Victorian fashion.